Bill O'Reilly loves to take out his aggression on Black Lives Matter. He's always talking very negatively about them. You're not going to be surprised by that. I've got a couple of clips for you, but then he talks about Martin Luther King and what he would do. And there I've got quotes from Martin Luther King that I think you're going to want to see. So first, here's O'Reilly talking about Black Lives Matter.
Enter American law enforcement, which is now under siege for allegedly treating black Americans more harshly than white Americans. Talking Points does not believe there is a design campaign of prejudice. What is happening here is cause and effect. Because black Americans commit far more crimes proportionally than whites or other ethnic groups, they come into contact with police more often. And that contact sometimes turns volatile.
Let's break that down in a couple of ways. Number one, see, it's not the cops' fault for stopping African Americans more disproportionately, as we've proven in every study. Stop and frisk in New York, disproportionate stops all over the country. I gave you all those stats on yesterday's show. But no, it's that it's black people's fault for being more violent and being more criminal. So if they got shot, they kind of had it coming. Now this guy is going to pretend to be on Martin Luther King's side in a second. And secondly, I just wanted to give you an explanation of the rhetorical trick that he used. There he said, now, talking points memo. First of all, dude, your talking points memo. Stop referring to it as if it's a human being. Talking points memo says that, believes that there is not a coordinated effort by design campaign of prejudice by police all across the country. That's a straw man. Nobody said there was a designed campaign of prejudice. It's not like the police chief in St. Louis called the one in Dallas, that called the one in San Antonio, and the one in Miami. And they're like, all right, let us now design it. Let's design a campaign of prejudice, everybody. It's go time. No, what we talk about on the show all the time, what Black Lives Matter is concerned about is unconscious bias. And yes, sometimes there's overt racism, of course. But we're not saying that there's a global conspiracy about it. So he puts up that straw man of like, they think that all the cops got together and decided to be racist against black people. No, they don't think that. In fact, there's study after study that shows the unconscious bias. In fact, I've got 5 studies for you later in this program that proves unconscious bias. Not just by police officers, but unfortunately by almost all Americans. It doesn't make them bad people. We're trying to get you to see the reality so that we can fix it. O'Reilly doesn't want you to fix it because he doesn't quite really mind the current situation. So now one more before we get to MLK.
With all due respect to President Obama, well-meaning activists do not associate themselves with a group that often commits violent acts and encourages violence through irresponsible rhetoric.
Okay, total nonsense. They love to throw out that lie so people say, oh no, Black Lives Matter is violent. I heard it on the Bill O'Reilly show. Do you know that the guy who actually did the shooting in Dallas, who he is now trying to connect to these black movements, was actually rejected by a lot of these movements? He was nowhere near Black Lives Matter. Dallas police chief says he had nothing to do with Black Lives Matter. But on top of that, he actually applied to be in the new Black Panther Party and a couple of other black movement groups. And you know what they did? They kicked him out. They said, this guy's unbalanced and he's trouble. He got kicked out of the Army for sexual harassment. We don't want anything to do with him. They blacklisted him. Now, O'Reilly never tells you that because that's inconvenient. Instead, he'd like to lie about it and pretend that he was part of those movements. The exact opposite of what's true. So now, finally, we get to MLK.
Dr. King would not participate in a Black Lives Matter protest.
So O'Reilly says that he knows what Martin Luther King would think. Yeah, I know. If King was alive today, I'm sure him and Bill O'Reilly would be buds. They'd go to Harlem and order some iced tea. And Martin Luther King would say, hey, look, if anyone is going to represent me later, Bill, I want it to be you. How could he possibly think that? But it's insane. 72-year-old audience, that's how old they are on average. Like, oh, yeah, Martin Luther King would have been on Bill O'Reilly's side and Fox News Channel side. Really? Well, let me actually quote Dr. King for you, and let's see how that turns out. So O'Reilly says, no, Dr. King was not in favor of these kind of vociferous protests. No, he believed in bringing people together and being moderate. Take it easy. Don't go around protesting things like this. He was a very calm guy. All right, well, let's find out. Martin Luther King said, I think America must see that riots do not develop out of thin air. Certain conditions continue to exist in our society, which must be condemned as vigorously as we condemn the riots. So he did condemn the riots. That's part of why he was such a great leader. But he said the conditions that led to those riots must be equally condemned. Do I see Fox News Channel doing that? Is Bill O'Reilly coming out and going, these protests, I mean, they have such a legitimate grievance, and I am super upset about what's happening to black people in this country. I haven't seen that segment on Talking Points Memo yet. All right, but I've got a lot more for you. So he said, King did, freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Now, of course, whenever you go to do that today, who opposes you? Bill O'Reilly saying, no, take it easy. First of all, calling me an oppressor, calling any police in the country oppressors, outrageous. Calling the government, calling the authorities oppressors, outrageous. And you can't demand anything. Just bow your head and know your role. Yeah, MLK would have been on your side, probably. Now, I want to quote the I Have a Dream speech, because you have heard that and you've heard the wonderful parts of it. But there's one part that they always leave out. So this is a direct quote from that speech. Martin Luther King said, I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. Isn't that funny that you almost never see the first part of that sentence? That they never share that with you? Certainly Fox News doesn't share it with you. Oh, no, Martin Luther King, I mean, he didn't go around calling people racist like Black Lives Matter does. Yeah, he called them vicious racists in Alabama. So those are the facts. All right. But hold, because I want you to know who the real Martin Luther King was. Because Martin Luther King believed in nonviolence. He believed in civil disobedience. But that didn't make him weak. That didn't make him a moderate. He wanted action, and he wanted it immediately. He fought against what he called the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. So let me tell you who the real MLK is, so this guy can't lie about him anymore. He said, I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizens counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for, quote, a more convenient season. It's almost as if he's talking directly to Bill O'Reilly and Fox News Channel and saying, screaming, no, I totally disagree with you. That I do not want you to tell me that this is a time for moderation and that it's more important to have order than it is to have justice. And that while I might possibly agree with your ideas, I certainly don't agree with your methods. It's exactly what Fox News does. The idea that these guys would have the audacity to try to claim that they're on Martin Luther King's side is sickening, revolting. I'm not done yet. Two more quotes from King. But in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity. Now that was the real Martin Luther King. That was powerful, and it worked. That's exactly why the Bill O'Reillys of the world don't want you to do that, because they don't want you to get that justice. All they want is status quo and order, the kind of order where they're in charge and you're not.